I'm Helen. I'm 82 years old, and I learned far too late that you cannot hand someone else the keys to your own peace and expect them to treat it like it's precious. I grew up in a house where moods filled the rooms before people did. My father's temper decided whether we were going to have a quiet evening or an evening walking on eggshells. My mother's sadness decided whether there would be music in the kitchen or just the sound of plates and cutlery. As a little girl, I became an expert in reading faces, in adjusting myself, in trying to keep everyone calm. If Daddy smiled, I relaxed. If he frowned, I shrank. Nobody taught me this on purpose, but children are quick studies when it comes to survival. What I didn't realize was that I was learning to make other people's feelings the center of my world. I carried that training straight into adulthood. When I married my husband Mark at 22, I thought love meant being whatever he needed me to be. If he was proud of me, I felt tall. If he was disappointed, I felt small. His compliments made me glow for days. His criticism could ruin a week. When he was in a good mood, I told myself we were a good couple. When he was distant, I lay awake at night wondering what I had done wrong and how I could fix it. My own opinion of myself was like a weather vane spinning in someone else's storm. It didn't stop with him. When our children came along, my sense of value moved to their reactions too. If they were happy, laughing, if the house was full and busy, I felt useful, needed, important. If they were quiet, if they slammed a door, if a teenager looked at me with that special kind of contempt only teenagers have, I felt like a failure. Their grades at school, their friends, their choices, all became secret scorecards for my worth as a mother. I didn't say that out loud, of course. I just lived it, day after day, letting my inner life rise and fall with whatever was happening around me. On the outside, I looked like a strong, devoted woman. People would say, "Helen, you're always there for everyone." And it was true. I was always there, in the practical ways, making meals, listening, patching things up, smoothing things over. What nobody saw, including me, was that I had no idea how to be there for myself. If you'd asked me then what made me happy, not what made me proud of my family, not what made me feel useful, but what truly made me happy from the inside, I don't think I could have given you a straight answer. The first crack in that way of living came when Mark retired. I was in my late 60s. Suddenly he was home all the time, restless and irritable, missing the structure of work, but not willing to say it out loud. His moods, which I'd been able to avoid for hours at a time when he was at the office, were now the wallpaper of our days. If he was bored, I felt responsible. If he was short-tempered, I tried to cheer him up, adjusted meals, suggested outings, invited friends over, then stopped inviting friends over when he didn't feel like socializing. My life narrowed around the project of keeping him content, and the more I tried, the less content either of us seemed to be. Then slowly, the children moved further into their own lives. They had marriages, divorces, jobs, children, illnesses, and they were all juggling too much. They still loved me, I know that, but the calls got less frequent, the visits shorter. When they did come by, I hung on every word, replayed every small kindness, worried over every small distance. If a week passed without a phone call, I would lie in bed at night, scanning the past conversations, asking myself if I'd said something wrong. In my 70s, I was still that little girl waiting for someone else's smile to tell her she was okay. The lonely season that changed me started the year I turned 75. Mark had a stroke in January. It didn't take him from me completely, but it took parts of him I had depended on, even the difficult parts. He became quieter, slower, less interested in the world. Our conversations shrank to simple things: meals, medications, the weather outside the window. I became his caregiver, fully, in a way I hadn't been before. And somewhere in that shift, something inside me went hollow. The man whose approval I'd chased for 50 years no longer had energy to give it or withhold it. The children, dealing with their own lives, couldn't fill that space for me, nor should they have. For the first time, I was left alone with the question I had been dodging all my life. If nobody is clapping, if nobody is frowning, if nobody is even watching, who are you, Helen? What is left? I didn't like the answer. At first, it felt like nothing was left. On the days when nobody called, I felt like I had disappeared. I would move around the house doing small chores just to prove to myself that I still existed. I checked my phone too often, waited for messages that didn't come, watched the clock. There was a day, I remember it clearly, when I sat at the kitchen table at 2 p.m, staring at my cold cup of tea, and realized that my mood was entirely dependent on whether a name appeared on a screen. It hit me as something almost ridiculous. I was 75 years old, and I had given that much power to a device and the people on the other end of it. The shift didn't happen all at once. It began with a very small, very quiet decision. I decided to do one thing each day that had nothing to do with what anyone else thought of me. Just one. It sounds almost laughable to say it like that, but when you've built your whole identity around other people, the idea of doing something purely because it pleases you feels almost selfish, like breaking a rule you didn't know you were allowed to question. The first thing I did was take a walk without telling anyone where I was going or how long I'd be gone. I just put on my coat, left a note for Mark, and walked. I didn't walk far, just around the neighborhood, past houses I'd been driving past for years without really seeing them. I noticed the trees. I noticed a cat sitting in a window. I noticed the way the light hit the pavement. I noticed that my shoulders slowly lowered from around my ears. When I came home, Nothing dramatic had changed. Mark was fine. Nobody had needed me in that half hour. But inside, something small and important had shifted. I had done something because it felt good to my own body, to my own mind, regardless of anyone else's mood. From there, I started experimenting. I read books I wanted to read, not just the ones people lent me. I turned off the news sometimes when it made me feel worse instead of more informed. I made myself a proper breakfast on mornings when Mark was still asleep, sitting down at the table with a plate and a real napkin instead of standing at the counter. I started writing in a little notebook again, not anything grand, just a few lines a day about what I noticed, what I felt, what I wanted. It was clumsy at first, like using muscles that had atrophied, but there was a quiet satisfaction in it that I'd never gotten from waiting for a kind word. There were harder parts, too. Learning to notice when I was slipping back into the old pattern of letting someone else's weather control my climate. If one of the children snapped at me on the phone because they were tired, my instinct was still to collapse inside, to spend the rest of the day feeling wounded. Now I would sit myself down, sometimes literally on the edge of my bed, and say out loud, "They're having a hard day. That's their weather. You don't have to bring it inside." It felt silly at first, talking to myself like that, but it helped. It created just enough space between their feelings and my identity. There came a day, a few years into this quiet retraining, when my youngest son was visiting. He was worried about his job, tense, distracted. I made us tea and he barely touched his. 10 years earlier, I would have twisted myself into knots, trying to fix his mood, to get him to talk, to say exactly the right comforting thing. This time, I listened. I offered what comfort I could, and when he had to leave abruptly to take a phone call, I felt a little stab of hurt, but I didn't let it define the rest of my day. I cleaned up the cups, I sat by the window, and I asked myself, what would feel kind to you right now? The answer, surprisingly, was a nap. So I took one. For me, that was a revolution. I'm not telling you this as a tidy, triumphant tale of independence. I still care what the people I love think of me. Their words still touch me deeply. But I no longer live as if their approval is oxygen, and without it, I will suffocate. Happiness, I've learned, isn't something you can expect another human being to manage on your behalf. They can add to it, they can share in it, they can make certain days brighter, but they cannot build the foundation of it for you. That foundation has to be laid quietly, inside your own chest, in the way you talk to yourself when nobody is listening, in the tiny choices you make when nobody is watching. If you hear yourself in any of this, if you feel your own mood swinging from high to low, depending on who texted back or who smiled at you today, I'm not judging you. I lived that way for decades. I just want to tell you that there is another way, and it doesn't require you to become hard or distant or to stop caring. It asks you instead to care for yourself with the same tenderness you've been giving everyone else. To ask sometimes, "What do I need?" before you rush to meet someone else's needs. To notice when you're handing your happiness to another person like a fragile object and saying without words, "Please don't drop this. If you do, I will break." You are allowed to hold it yourself. You are allowed to build small, steady sources of contentment that belong to you alone. A walk, a book, a prayer, a conversation with someone who sees you, a hobby that makes time disappear. You are allowed to believe that your worth is not up for a vote, not rising and falling with the temperature of a room or the tone of a voice.